We're going to go to the Middle East. Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen is coming up in a few moments. He is a Rice University Baker Institute Fellow for Public Policy and does a lot of work on the Middle East. He's got a new thing he's working on with the Gulf that we want to be able to talk about. And also the Saudi spat with the Canadian. How do you have a spat with the Canadians? Right now, we just had a spat with them. The man-child, Dr. Trudeau, we call him, the man-child, Pierre Trudeau, dumping dairy products and timber into the U.S., and the president saying he's had enough. And so he got all upset over it. And so the president said, sorry, I've had enough. And that's going to stop. But now the Canadians aggravate the Saudis, who threw them out of their country. To break all this down for us, how do you get the Canadians mad 2 times in 2 months, right? To break all this down for us is Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. And again, he is a senior fellow at the Baker Institute. That's Rice University's Baker Institute. And he also is an expert on the Middle East, working across the disciplines of political science, international relations, and international public economy. And his research examines the changing position in the Persian Gulf states in the global order. And he is with us now, and it's always an honor to have him on. Dr. Ulrichsen, great to have you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning.
So, Dr. Ulrichsen, you know, the Canadians, I mean, they're pretty an easygoing bunch of people, right? They hardly ever get mad at anybody. They don't make waves. I mean, it's Canada, right? It's Canada. So, obviously, they send a tweet out. And MBS, Prince bin Salman, doesn't like the tweet. And so all hell breaks loose. Can you break this down for us? I saw that. I almost thought when I was reading it, it was in The Onion. Like, I couldn't believe it. What went on here?
Well, I think a lot of news these days looks like something from The Onion.
I know. Exactly.
But I think the whole episode says more about the Saudis than the Canadians.
Yes.
The tweet was a statement in support of human rights advocates in Saudi Arabia who have been arrested. There have also been a number of women's rights activists who have also been arrested over the past 6 months. And in this particular case, there has been a blogger who's been in jail since 2012, and he'd been sentenced to 1,000 lashes. Only the first 50 were carried out in 2013, and since then he's remained in prison in Saudi Arabia. But this man's wife and children have been living in Canada and were recently granted Canadian citizenship as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a backstory there in the sense that this man in Saudi Arabia is seen as a kind of an enemy of the state, and the Canadians have taken his family in as asylum seekers and now as citizens. So when the Canadians tweeted in support of this family, the Saudis, I think, took that as a red line, and they interpreted it as a direct interference in their domestic affairs. They said, we will not accept orders from external sources. So you see a complete mismatch between, on the one hand, the Canadians speaking up for human rights and the Saudis interpreting it as a direct assault on their ability to do what they want to do within their own country. And they go absolutely mad and straight away announced they would expel the Canadian ambassador. And the Canadian ambassador who was kicked out of Saudi Arabia was also kicked out of Iran in 2012. So she must, the ambassador must be the only person to have been kicked out of both Saudi Arabia and Iran, which, given the geopolitical circumstances right now, must be some kind of an achievement. But it really shows that the Saudis are in absolutely no mood to take any form of international criticism, and perhaps they feel emboldened by sort of the turn of events in the world more recently, where you see a new shift towards authoritarian leaders in many countries, and so they feel they can get away with this right now.
Well, and absolutely no response from the U.S. Now, I know that the U.S. position has been to deal with Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, with kid gloves. I mean, we've really, Dr. Ulrichsen, turned a blind eye to a lot of what the Saudis have done recently for whatever reason. I mean, that was the first foreign trip the president took was to Saudi Arabia, lauding our relationship with them. But, MBS, the young crown prince there, I mean, he's consolidated power, as you know, in an unprecedented move, arrested his political opposition, saying that they were corrupt and whatever. Also, their economy is in the tank right now, right? So this guy's got a lot of issues, Doctor.
He does, and he has, and his supporters have really tried to paint a picture of a reforming, modernizing influence. See, he's 32 years old. The image they're trying to show is that this is a kid who's doing things differently, who is building a new Saudi Arabia, and that was very much on show when he came to the U.S. in March and April. He spent 3 weeks touring the U.S. trying to sell his Vision 2030. The reality, of course, as you just noted, is very different. He has accumulated power to an extent unprecedented in modern Saudi history. He's shown that he will brook no dissent whatsoever. He's shown a ruthless streak that I think even his defenders are struggling to explain all the time. And I think in foreign policy, he has a pattern of acting perhaps in a very rash manner without thinking through the implications of his actions. We saw with one of his very first decisions after he became defense minister and really became a public figure in 2015 was to launch the war in Yemen in the expectation it would be a quick, decisive military intervention. 3.5 years later, we see how they remain bogged down with no real apparent victory in sight. In 2017, he launched the blockade of Qatar, a major U.S. partner, and again, hasn't worked out the way he'd hoped, and he now finds himself stuck where he doesn't want to back away without losing face. We saw last November the episode where the Lebanese prime minister was detained in Saudi Arabia, and he suddenly resigned. He was detained for about 10 days. The president of France had to make a special appeal for him to be released. He then returned to Lebanon and unresigned as prime minister. And now this. And so we're seeing a pattern for unpredictable, volatile decision-making. And when it's Saudi Arabia with its importance in the Arab and Islamic world and its importance for world's energy markets, that's not something we necessarily find comforting if we wonder what's going to happen next when we wake up in the mornings and we see what he's done next. It is very different, and not necessarily in a good way.
I think that there's a lot of what's going on with Mohammed bin Salman right now that is not in the mainstream news. This Canada thing, I was shocked it didn't get a lot more coverage, and it didn't get complete condemnation from the State Department or the Trump administration. It's like they just never even put a statement out on it. It is coming up on 50 minutes past the hour. This is the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're with Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He is Rice University's man in the Middle East with the Baker Institute for Public Policy, and he's been studying the Gulf and the impact of the situation in the Middle East and how it is affecting the Gulf states. But even when you take the Lebanon situation, and the prime minister of Lebanon came to the United States and met with President Trump, there was a joint press conference in the Rose Garden, right? 3 weeks, not 3 weeks after that. I mean, I remember going to a reception for him at the Lebanese embassy. And 3 weeks after that, he resigns and he's in Saudi Arabia. And nobody could figure, and there was no coverage. This is the thing, Dr. Ulrichsen. There was no coverage on that. Like, I was trying to figure out what happened to him. And then he shows up in Paris 3 weeks after. Yes. And then he's back as prime minister. Like, how did this all happen?
Well, again, there's more of a backstory than the media would suggest. I mean, his father, Rafik Hariri, who was assassinated by Hezbollah in 2005,
right,
he'd also been prime minister of Lebanon, and his father actually had dual Saudi nationality as well. He was also the owner of a major Saudi construction company. It has gone into difficulty over the past 3 years, and they've filed for bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Hariri had history with Saudi Arabia. He was there for business reasons, I think, as well as political reasons. But as a prime minister of a a external state, you can't just treat someone like that, regardless of whether you think they have business difficulties or not. So the way he was treated was in violation, I think, of all international norms, and the pressure that was allegedly put on him to resign while he was in Saudi Arabia was, I think, unprecedented. And even on that occasion, we actually did have a pretty strong statement from Rex Tillerson when he was Secretary of State. He was actually pretty strong in just basically telling the Saudis this is not going to pass. Drop it, and they did. And I think that contrasts with what happened with Canada last week, when there was, as you say, virtually nothing. Because the Saudis, I think, will listen if the U.S. expresses a strong opinion, as Rex Tillerson did last November, when he basically said, this is unacceptable, it's got to stop. I think the risk for the Canadian situation is that there's been almost complete silence from the Trump administration and from the State Department. And it could almost encourage the Saudis to think if they can do this once, they can do it again. But I really think it says more about them. And if they begin to get a reputation for acting with such volatility and perhaps cavalier disregard for international norms, it will harm them, because Mohammed bin Salman really needs foreign investment. He's really trying to transform the Saudi economy. He has this big Vision 2030 to try and build a non-oil economy. And to do that, he's going to have to attract international investment. But people won't necessarily want to invest if they think they could suddenly lose their investments because of a political situation that they have no control over. And so I think while trade with Canada is quite small for the Saudis, a lot of people will be watching, because the Saudis have in the last couple of years also had disagreements with Germany and Sweden as well. So if you're looking to enter the Saudi market, you're going to want pretty strong guarantees that your investment will be somehow protected against political instability or political turbulence, and this doesn't help that cause. And I think he's really struggling to balance his need to open up to international investment with his desire to maintain complete control at home.
Dr. Ulrichsen, why the complete silence from the Trump administration on the expulsion of the Canadian diplomat from Saudi Arabia?
Well, again, as you mentioned, there has been, I think, a very warm relationship between the Trump administration and Mohammed bin Salman. Trump's first visit as president was to Saudi Arabia. 4 of his previous 5 predecessors have all gone to Canada. So there we see another imbalance of the Saudi-Canadian angle. We've seen, I think, Jared Kushner and others close to the president build very good personal ties with the Crown Prince. And I think it's very transactional. I think they feel that Saudi Arabia can do a lot in terms of injecting business and commercial ventures into the U.S. But I think also just more broadly, the Trump administration has shown that it's not necessarily prioritizing issues of human rights in the same way that other U.S. administrations might have done in the past. But from the beginning, there has been a sense that the relationship with the Saudis has been very warmly received, and they're focusing on much more on a transactional issue-based, transactional rather than issues-based relationship. And I think we see that very strongly.
We're with Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He's a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East. Dr. Ulrichsen, let's get to, we're talking about the Saudis now, and very suspect what they did with this Canadian diplomat in throwing them out of there. I was kind of shocked by it. I mean, I got kind of the first day of the Twitter war, I kind of got that. But then when they expelled the ambassador, I just couldn't believe it. Now, let's get to the blockade in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and the United Emirates still with this blockade on Qatar. It's gone nowhere. Now they're talking about, the Saudis are talking about building some kind of a moat. They don't even have the money for that. That's ridiculous, the way I look at it. But, okay, so they went into, like you say, they went into a military excursion into Yemen, that failed, or it's failing now. They thought it would be months. It's been extended period of time. The other day we just had kids bombed. I mean, it's horrible. Now you look what they've done in the Gulf. That's the blockade is just blown up in their face. How do they get out of this thing?
Well, I don't think they know. I think the difficulty is for the Saudis and for the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is how do you kind of back off without acknowledging that you may have made a mistake in the first place. With Yemen, we just see the Saudis, the Emiratis trying to do more of the same, and we see the horrific results.
Horrible.
We see the sort of what could be classified as war crimes being committed, which is doing them a lot of political damage in the West as well. In Qatar, as you say, they have resorted to gimmicks such as the proposal to build a moat that would literally turn Qatar into an island. And not only that, but to actually build a nuclear waste dumping site along the border. They want to build a civil nuclear energy program, and they want to dump their waste right along the Qatari border, which, again, doesn't necessarily build international confidence in the idea that a nuclear program in Saudi Arabia would not be used for geopolitical means. So that's a struggle for them. And I think the fact that they're stuck means that they're sort of reaching for these more and more far-fetched schemes. And again, the Canadian spats, you just see them doubling down. You saw the foreign minister on Wednesday last week, again, just saying, we demand Canada to apologize. And then Justin Trudeau kind of coming out, reaffirming his stance in support of human rights. So they're stuck. They don't necessarily they can't really acknowledge that perhaps they were overly hasty in the first place, and don't really have a plan other than to continue to try and escalate. But there's no real plan to resolve it. There's no real diplomacy. And I don't think they know quite what the end game is, as they have showed also in Yemen with the Lebanese Prime Minister and also with Qatar as well.
No end game. I think you hit it on the head, Dr. Ulrichsen. They do a lot of these things. There's no end game in sight. They're done in the moment, but there's no end game. And they certainly didn't think the blockade through. No question about that. I mean, they actually expected regime change or something, which was not really ever a potential. And I think they also really underestimated the competence of the Qatari government. That's one thing that I've said. People have asked me, why did this fail? There's a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest is all the bureaucrats in the Qatari government are highly educated. They've all got MBAs and PhDs. I mean, they've all gone to college, and they're smart people. And I don't think the Saudis ever understood that. And so that thing's backfired. The war is a disaster, and now we got this Canadian flap. I mean, you'd have to think, Dr. Ulrichsen, that at some time the Trump administration is going to lose either patience or confidence or something in their leadership, right?
Well, you would think at some point they would sit up and take notice.
At least
with the Qatari example, the Qataris have worked very hard to actually rebuild U.S. ties after Trump reacted so negatively last summer, initially supporting the Saudis. And the Qataris realized that they had to act, and they did. And they've really rebuilt close relationships with the U.S. government on every level. So at least there's an acknowledgement in the U.S. government right now that Qatar is an extremely important political, strategic, and commercial partner of the U.S. So they've done a sort of very good job there. But yes, for the Saudis, I mean, they kind of continue entering into these foreign policy debacles, and at some point one would imagine that they might bite off more than they can chew, although arguably they've already done that in Yemen. And again, every time they've taken a decision, they've sort of rushed in with plan A. But when plan A hasn't materialized, when Yemen didn't capitulate, the Houthis in Yemen didn't suddenly melt away, or when the Qatari government didn't suddenly fall, when the world didn't suddenly accept the Lebanese Prime Minister's resignation, we've seen there's not really a plan B. And I think the difficulty has been that they continue hoping that they can use a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and when that doesn't happen, they don't really have any other options.
There's no plan B. Dr. Ulrichsen, we want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Every time you come on, I learn so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Ulrichsen, Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy on the Middle East. Sir, thanks for being with us.